Good afternoon and welcome to the Rockefeller Center for our conversation with Governor Bill Weld, Governor and Presidential Candidate. We're going to have a conversation for about 25 minutes or a half an hour, after which we will take your questions. The way we're going to do that is that we'll have people come down the aisle at about the 20 or 25 minute point and collect the cards, and then I will do my best to group them around questions so that we can cover as many of the topics as possible. My name is Charlie Wheelan. I teach here at the Rockefeller Center, and I'm joined by Bill Weld, who was twice elected governor of Massachusetts. Before that, he was a U.S. attorney for Massachusetts. He holds degrees, both undergrad and law school, from Harvard, and he is now running for president of the United States. The topic for conversation is the future of the presidency, but I thought I would start by asking you about the current state of the presidency and politics more general before we talk about where we think things need to go.
Well, the current state of the presidency is we have an incumbent who's a would-be autocrat, make no mistake about that, who is an isolationist and believes we should trash our allies and cozy up to dictators abroad and rip up treaties, including treaties that are very much in the interest of the United States of America, and I'd like to reverse those things. I think there's also a subplot on the power of the presidency, and this president, President Trump, has declared a national emergency to secure a relatively limited amount of funding for a wall at the southern border because that's politically important to him. And purported to exercise the emergency powers of the presidency, which do exist. I think that might be kind of a stretch. Candidate Trump campaigned as a non-interventionist who didn't believe in boots on the ground necessarily, and that was one of the appealing things, I thought, as something of a libertarian to his candidacy. It has not worked out quite that way in practice. I remember a recent event when he announced very suddenly that he was going to send 5,000 more troops to the Middle East, and he didn't say why, and changed his mind the next day. And I think it came out of a single conversation with his national security advisor. So the president has been known for, having position A on day one and different positions on day 2, 3, and 4. So it's hard to really lay at his door an interventionist policy. But I do think damage has been done to the national interests of the United States by, for example, his pulling the rug out from under the Kurds, who were very helpful to us in Iraq as well as Syria. And we'll come back to Syria. But basically, my thought is that I hope very much that the future of the American presidency doesn't look like the present.
The president includes a remarkably partisan environment that predated President Trump, obviously. So can you talk a little bit about that partisanship, how we got there, and how that relates to the current state of the presidency?
Sure. I mean, I first worked in Washington as a staffer for Senator Jack Javits of New York before I even went to law school. And it was a wonderful time. The Kennedys were in the Senate. There were all kinds of moderate Republicans, Chuck Percy, and everybody reached across the aisle and wanted to work together. And if someone was giving an important speech in the Senate, the galleries would be absolutely filled with summer interns, reporters, spouses wanting to hear the speech. And other members of both the House and the Senate wanted to hear the speech in real time to see whether they would be persuaded by it, because people were still being persuaded. And there was not a sense of this animal called reaching across the aisle, because you didn't have to reach. You were right there, and everybody wanted to do the right thing. And I think the worm began to turn with the 1994 election. I saw quite a lot of Newt Gingrich when he was the minority leader there, and the Democrats didn't even let him have a door on his office. They had a saloon door on his office, so he couldn't have a private meeting. And I could be wrong, but I don't think Newt forgot that when he became Speaker in 1994. So that was the beginning of the poison direction. And that was assisted, of course, by extreme gerrymandering by both parties, bringing it about that you were more likely to be knocked off in a primary than you were in a general. And that drove incumbents of both parties to the extreme. But beyond that, there's grown up a fetish, an obsession with being reelected. And the parties in Washington, and I've said this before, last cycle, for example, but they seem to me to be locked in a death spiral embrace. And they need each other to scare their own base into giving them enough money so they can get reelected. And then as soon as they've both been reelected, they come back and it's a totally different set of rules. No more demonizing, just let's get together and we'll compromise. The Dems want to raise social spending 5%, the R's want to raise defense spending 5%. So they get together and compromise by raising everything 20%, and we have another $1 trillion deficit. So the situation really couldn't be worse. The incentives are worse and the outcomes are worse.
You were nominated to be ambassador to Mexico, but the nomination did not get a hearing in the Senate, which was an indicator or harbinger of things to come. So could you talk about that particular development and then what it means for how the Senate and the government has operated since?
Sure. Well, that was Senator Jesse Helms, and it wasn't personal to me. It was payback for me resigning from the Justice Department at the end of the 80s on account of the situation of Ed Meese, who was then the Attorney General, who I thought was bringing politics into the Justice Department. Matter of fact, I didn't have to guess, because I'd go up to the 5th floor of the Justice Department, and there would be groups there, political groups being entertained by the Attorney General in the Attorney General's conference room. No business before the department whatsoever, just pure politics. And I had spent 5 years as U.S. Attorney in Boston trying, I think successfully, to keep politics out of law enforcement, because that's a terrible path to go down. You know, the Justice Department is supposed to do justice without fear or favor. And when you introduce politics into that equation, and I have an awful feeling that that's happening again under Attorney General Bill Barr, who was a stand-up Attorney General under George Bush 41, but seems to have drunk the Kool-Aid that Donald Trump purveys, which is that everybody in the Justice Department exists to protect the president's political skirts. The Attorney General is the people's lawyer. He's not the president's lawyer. And anyone who thinks contrary is taking us down a dangerous path.
Some of the things you mentioned, the gerrymandering, the increasing partisanship, are structural problems. What can we do to change the incentives and the behavior, the results from those incentives? And then people passed up note cards before you even got here. Do you think that the two-party system will endure?
Well, I'm not so sure. I think if the Republicans line up behind the president, a great number of them are going to lose their seats next year, and you might see a restructuring of the Republican Party, such as happened to the old Whig Party in the 1850s, when half the party became the know-nothings. They were an anti-immigrant party characterized by violent rallies and conspiracy theories, the lineal forebear of the Trump movement. And the other half joined John C. Fremont and the Free Soil Party in the election of 1856, which did okay, didn't win, but 4 years later they elected Abraham Lincoln the President of the United States. So I like to think that the remnants of the Republican Party, those who were trashed by President Trump in 2016, might rise to elect an Abraham Lincoln, someone representing the better angels of our nature, for want of a better word, as president in 2020.
In the current environment, you've decided to run for president. Walk us through that thought process and how you hope it will unfold.
Well, I thought beginning in 2018 that the president had become a threat to our democratic institutions. Such actions as proclaiming from the rooftops that a free press is the enemy of the people, that's right out of the playbook of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and every other would-be tyrant in history, and trying to cancel elections and talking about, isn't it wonderful how Xi Jinping did away with elections in China, and I, Donald Trump, want to have truck with President Kim of North Korea, who I've really fallen in love with because he's such a strong kid. He killed his own uncle. He killed his own brother. Remember on the airport, those kids coming up and smearing poison, and it killed him. He's a very strong leader. Strong. I'm not making this up. He said all those things. So I began to have a concern about this. And every time I hear someone say the Pledge of Allegiance with the word indivisible in, I pledge allegiance to the flag, et cetera, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And the president's theory, as enunciated by Steve Bannon and himself is to divide the country as much as he can. And I've begun to fear for social cohesion in this country. And it's not without reason. The president has publicly predicted a civil war, capital C, capital W, if he's not reelected in 2020. So we have, narcissism mixed with megalomania, mixed with egomania, and, as I've often said, I wouldn't want his demons. I feel sorry for the president, but not so sorry that I won't try and knock him off in this election and keep him from destroying our democracy.
So this was not your first bid, national bid. You were Gary Johnson's vice presidential nominee. Can you talk about your own personal political evolution and how it got you to this point here?
Well, I came up, I guess you could say, as a centrist Republican. I always was a fiscal conservative. I was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor in the country when I was in office in the 1990s by the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute. They're the only two institutions that care about that. But it's true. So I'm an economic conservative, and the Republican Party used to be identified with that. It used to be identified with environmental protection, conserving the environment, not under Mr. Trump, but that's very important to me. Climate change is very important to me. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act were both enacted in the early 70s under Richard Nixon. Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt were both great environmentalists as well. And socially, I've always been open, and I was 20 years ahead of my time on both being pro-choice as a Republican on reproductive rights issues, and volubly so, wanting to make sure that Planned Parenthood got taken care of. And much was forgiven me at the time by the National Party because I raised a lot of money for them. But anyway, so on that and on gay and lesbian civil rights, I was 20 years ahead of my time. Everyone thought I was crazy. They said, don't you know you're supposed to be on one side or the other? These are my fellow governors. And they were just having fun and smiling. But it was true. There was very little going across those aisles in those days. And that's persisted to this day. And I've recognize more and more that I am on the libertarian side of the Republican Party. I read Friedrich Hayek with considerable interest in law school, and ever since then I've identified as someone who believed in the primacy of individual liberties and individual rights over assertions of government power. In the ratification of the Constitution debates, I would have been an anti-federalist. Too much power to the federal government, too much power to the executive branch.
We had Matt Dowd here last week, so chief political correspondent for ABC, who argued that the Republicans in the Senate in particular are not afraid of Trump, they're afraid of the base as represented by Trump. So you would have to appeal to a Republican Party that is not comfortable with a lot of the things that you just described. So walk me through how you would redirect a party that doesn't necessarily believe in climate change, is increasingly
Well,
less.
I would redirect it if I got in there along the lines I've just discussed. I wouldn't have one message for Republicans who were scared of the base and another message for the base. I have the same message for everybody. But I would say to the Republicans who are up for re-election in the Senate and who are scared of the base, they might want to look at a couple of statistics. Number one, that 51% of the people in the United States, both parties, believe the president should be removed. And they cannot take solace in the fact that the Republican Party is 20-80 on impeachment and removal. In other words, only 20% in favor and 80% against, because they're not going to keep their seats if they win their primary. They've got to win the general election. So, as I look in the crystal ball, a month is an eternity in national politics, particularly a month between now and the New Hampshire primary on February 11th. And if that 51% figure, 51% nationally for removal, should creep up to 60%, I think those Republicans may remember that they have no fondness for the president. They have to resent his pushing them out to walk the plank and demand that they always, as I say, watch his political skirts. And so I think they may begin to rethink the issue of removal.
So we actually have an institutional question. We were talking before, and you were involved in Nixon's impeachment. Is that right? You were working in Washington?
Yes, with a young Yale lawyer named Hillary Rodham, I wrote with others the book on what's grounds for impeachment and removal of a president. And I reread it. It's a 57, very trenchant document the other day, and it rings absolutely true, and it makes clear that the two things uppermost on the minds of the framers were foreign interference in our affairs and corruption of office. And that was a time when monarchs were still regularly bribed. So they talked at the debates on the convention. What about bribery of a president? A person so strong would want to monopolize power. Chilling.
And if you read Washington's address, worries about factions, which would be partisanship. So
Right.
we've kind of got the trifecta. So we actually have an institutional question, which is, and I'm going to add a little to it. Are you concerned about the way Congress and the Supreme Court have reacted to this situation? And do you have ideas about how we can rebalance the respective powers of the three branches?
Well, I think it's time to lighten up a little bit on the reins in the executive branch. Ever since Lyndon Johnson, I suppose you could say ever since FDR, but somehow that seems more benign. It didn't have the Vietnam War, it had World War II. But there's been a trend to increasing power in the presidency. And I was watching at least pretty closely when Lyndon Johnson was president, and the accretion of power to the executive branch was stunning. A major member of Congress would assume that some sub-cabinet official would write his or her speech to make him or her look good. And that power was assumed and arrogated by the executive branch. And the area where this is most troublesome, in my view, is foreign affairs, where the constitutional pretty clearly grants the power to declare war to Congress and to nobody else. And you had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1961 that pushed that a little bit to where a president could say, oh, well, this resolution is equivalent. It wasn't. Nobody was thinking about that. But I think in foreign affairs, President Obama tried to walk that back a little bit with respect to Syria, and it blew up because it didn't look good. But I would be one who really did not believe in boots on the ground every time we see something in another country that we don't agree with or don't like. And I hate to say this, but that was a major part of the reason for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I was pretty close to the George W. White House at that point. And they were outraged by things they saw over there. And people are outraged by, attitudes towards women in Afghanistan and in many African countries, but that's not material for boots on the ground. It's just a bunch of body bags with 19, 20, 21-year-olds coming back from that, and maybe the people who sent them feel better, but they really shouldn't.
So that would be a more hands-off foreign policy. This is one of the questions here.
I wouldn't generalize my foreign policy as being hands-off, because I do believe in robust engagement, and I think Mr. Trump is far too far down the line towards isolationism, but that has to do with foreign trade as well as diplomatic engagement.
Actually, one of the questions, would you sign the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Yeah, I sure would. That puts us with a beachhead in Asia with 12 Pacific-facing nations. And candidate Trump opposed it on the grounds that it would be dominated by China. He didn't know that China is not a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which rather undoes his grounds for objection. But it's not the only time that I've seen unbelievable ignorance on the part of not only candidate Trump, but President Trump. And he makes no bones about the fact that he doesn't like to read, except People magazine, and he doesn't like to listen to anybody because he knows more than any of the experts, and he's smarter about national security than anyone from the CIA or the National Security Council. Again, that's him talking, not me. So it's part of this solipsism, this extreme self-absorption, which may be entertaining in a character in a movie, not so much in a president of the United States.
You were picked as the most fiscally responsible governor. I think if they were giving the awards at the federal level today, there would not be many nominees. Could you talk?
Bill Clinton, the last surplus.
Contemporary nominees. Could you talk Talk about why, what you think the fiscal challenge is. So here we are at near full employment, running $1 trillion deficit with arguably large infrastructure and human
Yeah,
capital.
no, it's ludicrous. And the reason I got ranked #1 was because we engaged in what's called zero-based budgeting, where you look at the outcome you wanted to achieve with this appropriation last year. And if it didn't do a good job, if it's just a bureaucracy and nobody can tell you what they did, you don't take that to 50% or you don't give that a 10% haircut. You abolish that. That's why it's called zero base. And that's how we were able to cut the budget in Massachusetts in absolute dollars, not just percentage dollars, year over year, which is where that award came from. And as so often, you know, the only commodity in short supply in Washington, D.C. is political will. If you have political will to do so, it doesn't cost a thing to reach across the aisle. You know, my first couple of months in office, I called up the Senate President and the Speaker of the House and said, why don't we have tea and cookies every Monday afternoon at 3:15? It'd be good to just share war stories and talk about what jerks everyone else in the State House is, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't say all that, but that's what the meetings turned into. They turned into almost joke sessions, but usually, unless there was something that had to be ironed out. But the result was that no one ran to the press and called someone else a jerk, and no one stabbed someone else in the back before the next weekly meeting, because it's just tougher if you have this social relationship. And it worked out well enough so every governor, every Speaker of the House, every Senate President since then has continued the Monday afternoon meetings to this day. And it's been a golden age of bipartisan cooperation in Massachusetts.
So it is curious that the most popular governors in America, Charlie Baker, Larry Hogan, are Republican governors in deep blue states. Can you tell, is that a curiosity or is there something to that?
Well, I referred to Charlie Baker throughout my time in office as the heart and soul of the Weld-Cellucci administrations, which he was. He was my campaign advisor, first on insurance, then on healthcare, then on everything. And we were fellow disciples of David Osborne, who wrote a book called Laboratories of Democracy, about how the states can serve as models for the federal system, which I deeply believe in. So, yeah, he's popular because he should be popular. Same for Larry Hogan in Maryland, who is again, a model of someone who's comfortable in their own skin, a quality I'd like to see more of in Washington, particularly in the White House. And has the courage of their own convictions and doesn't have a particular agenda to rub anyone else's nose in anything.
So I would invite you, we'll send folks down the aisle. If you have questions that you've written on your note card, pass them to the aisle and we will pick them up. In the meantime, Jeff Flake has said that an anonymous vote in the Senate would likely result in impeachment. But the fact that it's a vote out loud means it might not happen. So what are the near-term things we can do, more immediate than the structural reforms, to try and ameliorate that partisan environment?
Well, I've been suggesting coyly, perhaps even meretriciously, that Mitch McConnell in the Senate plays a long game, he plays a deep game, but he's responsible to his caucus. And if he got the idea that his caucus privately didn't approve of the president, would be just as soon rid of him, there would be 30 to 35 votes for removal from Republicans. So I've been wondering out loud whether it might not be a handy idea to have just kind of a straw poll. You know, just everybody write down what they think on a piece of paper, push it across the table. Nobody will see it except me and Mitch McConnell. And that would be the equivalent of a secret ballot, although not at the end of the process, sort of in the beginning of the process. But I agree with Senator Flake that if the senators were absolutely free to vote their consciences or their wishes without fear of counterattack and vindictive behavior on the part of the president and his administration, they would vote to remove him in a minute. So, and since then it's occurred to me that Mitch McConnell is smart enough to have one-on-one conversations to get the equivalent of that. I mean, when Nancy Pelosi says, my caucus wants X, it's not because she took a public poll of her caucus, it's because she talked to every single person. And I remember that from when I was in Washington.
And to be clear, I think I know the answer to this. Someone asked, do you favor impeaching Trump? And if so, would you add to the current articles of impeachment to include things beyond the July phone call?
Yes, I'm in favor of the president being not only impeached by the House, but removed by the Senate. And I would add, at a minimum, the 10 instances of obstruction of justice, very clear and convincing cases of obstruction, criminal obstruction, well beyond anything Richard Nixon ever did with respect to the Watergate break-in. And I'm not sure I'd go a heck of a lot further than that, but you never know. You know, I was head of the criminal division. I was a U.S. attorney for 5 years. I presided over literally hundreds of long lead time grand jury investigations of financial crimes and political misconduct. And you often come up with stuff that you had no idea would pop out until you called a witness in the grand jury, and look what came out. So there could be some surprises along this path.
We have another legal question, actually. The Supreme Court ruled that the families of the Sandy Hook victims would be able to sue the weapons manufacturer. I think it's Remington. Do you have a thought on that?
Sandy Hook was the worst of all. You know, that was my abiding thought about Sandy Hook is that's an argument for red flag laws, where anyone who knew of an individual who owned a bunch of guns and had either a history of violence or expressed sympathy for violence or carried around, like one of the Texas shooters recently, when he was in high school, a list of all the people he'd like to kill, could petition a judge. So it's somebody authoritative, just as we do in cases of domestic violence. You can get in front of a judge in this country in 6 hours. It's not like being in Russia. And the judges are independent. And make a case that this person should not have 6 guns in his apartment, and particularly not this kind of gun. And if the judge says gone, or you know the person has to come in and show cause and answer this, that would I think be something we could do that would definitely cut down on the number of these mass shootings by people who have demonstrated histories of either violence or expressing sympathy for terrorism. Furthermore, you know, 2/3 of the gun deaths in this country every year are by suicide, and this would permit anyone who's a co-worker or a family member, indeed anyone with knowledge of the individual, to apply to a judge and make a showing that the gun possessor was a danger to others or to himself or herself, and that might address the terrible rash of suicides as well. Those would both be good things.
Do you think that the lawsuits against the gun manufacturers are likely to be fruitful?
No, I don't know about that. It would depend on the facts of the case, and for example, if there were, you know, highly destructive automatic weapons and were not sold in a manner consistent with the existing federal prohibition on sale of automatic weapons to anyone except a licensed firearm dealer, yeah. But that's facts that I don't know that they're yet in evidence.
Why can't we use nuclear power to solve climate change?
We absolutely have to. I think that climate change has become such a planetary issue and such a threat that opposition to nuclear power is no longer responsible. The Union of Concerned Scientists, which had been sort of anti-nuclear power, recently modified their position on that. And I've said, even before climate change came to the fore, I've said that nuclear power should be at least 25% of the base in our grid. I know a lot of rural counties that would love to have another nuclear plant. They already do have one. They know they're great employers, they're great neighbors. You know, people sit around saying, why can't they invent something that has no carbon emissions and can produce an almost infinite amount of power? And the answer, they did a long time ago. The good Lord, or whoever you want to say, invented it. It's called the atom. So we've got to have a change there, and it's got to come from the president, because there's enormous institutional bias against nuclear power from the, I don't know, the Dukakis-Sununu wars between Mass and New Hampshire years ago, demonizing Seabrook. But if you look at the country of France, which adopted nuclear power out of a clear blue sky, to satisfy 75% of their needs for power in either the 70s or the 80s. It was the largest single reduction in carbon emissions into the atmosphere on record, and not a whisper of an accident. People think about accidents like Fukushima, where they built ginormous nuclear reactors on behalf of barrier reefs. Well, who knew? One tsunami comes along and spoils your whole day, but that was foreseeable.
Rockefeller is the home for students who want to get involved in public affairs. So we have a couple questions about student involvement. The first is just, what would you tell a student who wants to get involved in either politics or public service but looks around at this current environment and is deeply discouraged?
Well, I don't know. There's got to be some candidate out there that you think is at least passable. As a default position, maybe volunteer to help Pete Buttigieg or myself, somebody like that. I did. And my whole career, this is actually advice for students. My whole career goes back to volunteering for a state representative to do some research work, a liberal Republican. In Massachusetts, and 3 or 4 years later he got a call from Tom Railsback, who was a congressman from Illinois, who says, hey, I'm on judiciary, they're looking for sane Republicans to come work on the Republican side on the Nixon impeachment. Do you know anybody? So he sent me down there. And it was all because I spent an entire summer afternoon working on the 5th floor of the State House instead of joining the Make Love Not War rally, which was in progress right outside the window on the Boston Common.
Do you think that was a mistake?
That depends who you're asking. But no, it was the beginning of my whole career, because having that position got me interested in criminal law and litigation. So I went back and became a criminal litigator, ran for attorney general, got the U.S. attorney's position when Reagan was elected president. It's been the basis for everything I've done since. But I remember Sandra Day O'Connor once speaking at a New England law school commencement in Boston, telling the students, do little things well. Somebody will notice. And I was just doing a little thing. But I do think it's a great idea to get involved in politics, whether it's going to your local, Democratic or Republican clubhouse, if there still are such things, and saying, I want to get involved, I want to meet people, I want to know about elections, or perhaps more safely volunteering for an existing office holder who you kind of like the cut of their jib. See no downside risk there.
Small world story, Railsback was my grandfather's law partner.
Oh, no kidding, no kidding.
Another student question, very micro and very local, which is, do you have a view on whether students should be able to vote in New Hampshire? There's a kerfuffle over whether students have to get licenses in the state of New Hampshire to vote here.
No, of course they shouldn't. I mean, we should just follow the law. And the existing kerfuffle is because Mr. Trump came here in August and said, oh, there were thousands of fraudulent votes cast in New Hampshire last time. Fraudulent votes. He's saying the students shouldn't be able to vote here because they're a suspect group. They're no better than a minority voting group in the view of the Trump folks in Washington. And my whole thrust here is to try to get more people involved in voting rather than fewer, more millennials, more Gen Xers, more women who I think are on the receiving end of some very unattractive policy making out of Washington. And the Trump administration, I think, has supported some relatively obvious voter suppression efforts, mainly in areas of the country with substantial minority populations. So they're on the other side of that issue.
I assume the Republicans have disaggregated the demographics by age in particular, and the future, just on demographics alone, if nobody ever changes their minds and older people die off, it's not good for the Republicans. So in the back rooms, are people thinking about that in the party?
I wouldn't know. I'm not in the back rooms of the Republican Party. I don't think they're coming out for the millennial vote, because if they were, they'd be saying climate change, they're going to park the hearse at your door. You're going to reap the whirlwind on that if no action is taken. $1 trillion deficits, ditto. Don't you millennials look forward to Social Security if the $1 trillion deficits continue. So I think the policies that the administration is pursuing are essentially a gun aimed at the head of the younger generations. So I don't think that they're having constructive conversations in the back rooms.
But there must be an awareness. I mean, can you explain what is clear to everybody and the lack of action to preserve the long-term viability of the party?
Well, I'm kind of on the other side from those people in Washington who, I agree with you, don't seem to be taking actions to preserve the long-term viability of the party. They seem to be actions calculated to result in the blow-up of the party.
And if you are going a different direction, do you have a favorite Donald Trump insult that he has lobbed your way?
No, he hasn't insulted me. Are you kidding me? I don't exist. No, my favorite Donald Trump insult was against Mrs. Khan, favorite only in one sense, most typical, whose son was killed fighting for the United States in the Middle East. And she was a Muslim. And he said, I don't know what her problem is. She obviously has been muzzled by her religion. She's a Muslim, you know, and she didn't speak up. And I'm sure she's been muzzled by her religion because she's a Muslim. I don't know what her problem is. Her problem is that her son is dead, and the President of the United States was attacking her by name for not speaking up and saying, I'm so sorry, my son is dead, just keeping her thoughts to herself. Classic Donald Trump.
So his Twitter account has obviously been a weapon. For much of your political career, there was no social media. Certainly my first political jobs were that way. Can you talk about the role that social media, not just the Twitter, the Trump and Twitter and so on, but more broadly, its relationship to partisanship, the new role that it plays in the White House and so on?
Well, and the disinformation proceeding from bots abroad and efforts to interfere with our elections are very troubling. No, it's a completely new world, even since the last cycle. You can't plan on doing broadcast media to get your message out these days. It's got to be social media. Not too many people are watching broadcast TV, and those that are have probably already made up their mind in one direction or the other based on the content of what they're watching. So it's a complete ultimatum now to go the social media direction.
So if you put on both your political and your legal hat, what, if anything, would you do to try and cull out the overtly fake news on these channels where many people, that is their primary source of information?
You know, and do I want Mark Zuckerberg to be told, police political advertising? No, I don't think so. I'm enough of a First Amendment partisan to hope that some way can be found to ferret out the really poisonous stuff and perhaps, make it a criminal offense in certain cases. So then the government, with all its power, could come to seek redress for that. But breaking up big tech or telling Zuckerberg he's got to police the accuracy of his political advertising, that just runs so flatly against the First Amendment in my book that that would not be my opening position.
That's a good lead into this question. So please describe what your notion of an ideal libertarian USA would be like in fairly specific terms. So the social safety net, Social Security, Medicare, opioid crisis, minimum wage. I mean, there are a lot of fairly serious issues that defy
There are, and let me just say something very general about how my thinking has evolved in the last 5 years perhaps. So Richard Nixon was removed from office or resigned from office partly because of a theory that our staff developed that he'd violated his oath because he failed to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So that was kind of a legalistic, it's called the take care clause. And as I look at Trump's Washington and as I reflect on the suffering I see in the world, and as I reflect on the fact that 18% of Americans are living below the federal poverty level, doesn't mean they're starving to death, but they're below the federal poverty level, should not be the case in the United States of America. We're just too rich of a country. And that, the president has succeeded in sowing division in the ranks and setting everyone's teeth on edge and stimulating not only resentment but envy throughout the populace, and that there are groups, the president singles out racial and religious groups all the time attack them and say that they're dangerous and all Mexicans are murderers and rapists and anyone coming across the border is going to take your job, so you should be resentful and vote for me, Trump, and probably harass your wife thereafter, so you should be doubly resentful. When I reflect on all that and the division of groups and the stigmatization of groups, I think that the President of the United States, as chief executive of the country, has a duty to take care of everybody, not just take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that goes a long way to describing how my ideal United States and my ideal libertarian world would look like.
How about criminal justice reform? That seems like a place where Republicans and Democrats ought to be able to come
No,
together.
I'm all for it. I agree with Senator Cory Booker's bill to let 17,000 people out of federal prisons, now being held in federal prisons for minor marijuana possession offenses that happened more than 6 years ago. People are serving 8, 10, 12-year sentences for possessing ounces of marijuana, you know, long time ago. And there's 17,000 of those cases, and those sentences should be commuted. And that's it's partly a criminal justice, also partly a racial justice issue. And I've gotten into this subject in depth, and the average person who's convicted of marijuana possession, if they're black, they're 4 times as likely to get arrested, who is found with a possessory amount of marijuana. If they're black, they're 4 times as likely to get arrested as if they're white. If they get arrested, they're 4 times as likely to get a prison sentence. If they get a prison sentence, it's likely to be 4 times as long. So that's a 64-to-1 ratio. That's really unacceptable. And that's not just a statistic. Another outrage is our current bail system, which just makes sure that everybody poor who gets arrested languishes in jail awaiting their trial, which doesn't come for a long time because, for example, they're required to post cash, which is, you know, unrealistic in the case of many people arrested. Or any vehicular violation is held to be a violation of parole. So if you have a traffic ticket that you can't pay, you're back in jail. I mean, this is back to the days of imprisonment for debt. So I have a son who works for an affiliate of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which does a lot of good work in these areas. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be done there.
So say, if you've got questions, let's do one final sweep for no cards. Now, I'm going to combine a couple here, which is how would you invest in infrastructure? And I would add some of the other human capital needs that the country needs, particularly with artificial intelligence and technology coming down the pike, at the same time that you would inherit a huge and growing deficit, in part because of our Medicare and Social Security obligations. How would you juggle both of those things?
Well, a couple things. On artificial intelligence and robotics and drones and machine learning and driverless cars, all of which are technical advances, which are going to cost us 15% of all the existing jobs in the United States over the next 10 years, not 20 years, 10 years, all the experts will tell you. There's 2 items of good news there. One, artificial intelligence is going to create a vast amount of wealth in this country because it's going to make everything so much more efficient. Separate question, how is that wealth distributed? But, you know, these forces should be harnessed to the extent we can and taken advantage of and diverted to the use of the greater good without confiscatory tax policies. And the other bit of good news is there will be replacement jobs as the economy gets more technical, but they require skill sets that the people who will lose these existing jobs don't quite have yet. But it's not like they have to become, you know, PhDs or rocket scientists. They need 2 or 3 semesters of post-high school, post-secondary training. And it would be child's play. I can tell you, as a 2-term governor, to govern is to choose, and you choose among priorities, whether they're state or federal. It would be child's play for any state, without even federal assistance, to take 1/3 of 1% of its budget and devote it to making that post-secondary, those semester courses, free to the displaced workers. It wouldn't be that expensive. It wouldn't be like Senator Sanders and everything is free in education. And then the people would have the skill sets to get the replacement jobs, which in most cases would be, because they're more technically requisite, higher wage jobs than the jobs that were lost. So that's something that should be done. And I don't know that anyone, maybe Andrew Yang is getting a little bit close to the situation, but the Trump administration, no. And those are Trump voters. Those are people losing their jobs who are, fertile ground for his appeals. You should be resentful. So that'd be one thing I would do.
That's new spending. So how would you deal with yawning Medicare obligations, Social Security, pensions at the state level, all those obligations, they're growing even before we invest in where workers
Social
have to go.
Security, we have to restructure the trust fund. There's some little things that could be done, all of which are unpopular. A means test, raising the requirement age, raising the amount that the Social Security tax going in would be imposed on in the first place. All of those would be in the right direction, but they wouldn't do it by themselves. But I'd probably start by chipping away with those three things, and then talk about a radical restructuring of the trust fund to make the system solvent.
And on the healthcare side? Healthcare more generally, and the Medicare costs that are contributing to the deficit.
Yeah, Medicare for all in the Senator Sanders, Senator Warren model, I don't think is remotely affordable with the current capitalist system we have in the United States. I've read the list of tax increases that would have to be passed to make that financeable, and for openers, all capital gains will be taxed the same way as ordinary income. There are reasons why capital gains tax are taxed differently. One is capital formation, and another is to give people a break when they're creating and building an enterprise over time. And the rates would go up staggeringly, and Senator Warren certainly has her wealth taxes, which sound good, but they remind me of the debates that were held about the adoption of the progressive income tax at the federal level in 1913, and the people who were opposed to it, and it was 0.5% on income. People who were opposed to it said, well, what would prevent some future Congress from raising a tax to 1% or even 2%? And the proponents said, and this argument prevailed, the proponents said, ridiculous. The possibility that a power could be abused is an insufficient argument against its existence. Okay, I took economics a few years later. The marginal, Jack Kennedy was president, the marginal rate was 91%. So that wealth tax is not going to stay at 2%. It's going to taste really good.
Are you a carbon tax supporter?
Oh yes, putting a price. I don't call it a tax because I wouldn't have the government keep the money. And you wouldn't have to. You put a price on carbon, say $20 a ton. You allow it to float with the market. It would probably rise to 40 or 50 before the emitters of carbon stopped putting too much in the system. But it would achieve what we have to do, which is to prevent the atmospheric temperature from raising 1.5 degrees centigrade, or more than that, between now and 2050. And it's imposed upstream, at the wellbore, at the mine shaft, at the loading dock, so it's not felt by consumers.
Directly.
Directly, yeah, no, that's right. And it's no day at the beach. It's for openers a regressive tax. And I would address that by having it remitted perhaps through the payroll tax, focusing on lower income voters, because I am worried about income inequality for reasons of, as I was saying a minute ago, social cohesion.
Couple interesting questions. What's your position on DACA?
Oh, I'm with DACA all the way. Are you kidding me?
All right, this is either harder or just different.
I'm about to lose that in the Supreme Court, but it doesn't mean I'm not for it.
Among your achievements, you have published 3 popular novels. How does your political experiences influence or inspire your writing?
Well, the first 2 were pot boilers, written about an ambitious young prosecutor from New York who moves to Massachusetts, gets elected to the Senate, moves to Washington, has all kinds of hijinks there. Mark Twain said, write what you know. There's not an original word in those 2 books. And I dictated them. Having been a litigator, I could dictate a memo in an hour that would be 10 pages typescript. So The first draft of the first book took me 8 days, and the first draft of the second book took me 70 days. And the dialogue was very good, but basically they were pot boilers. And the third one, I was much more sensitive and wrote longhand, pen and ink. It was a moving coming-of-age tale about a 15-year-old in western Massachusetts whose world is obliterated by the mean Boston politicians coming in, flooding the Swift River Valley in his native towns to create drinking water for the greedy citizens of Boston, something that could never happen today. And it didn't, it took me 2 years to write instead of 8 days, and didn't sell all that well either.
There's actually a follow-up here, which is quite interesting, which is your intellectual background, including your writing of fiction, several Harvard degrees, is at odds with a growing skepticism against experts. And I think that's a bit on the right, but certainly on the left as well. Can you talk about that growing skepticism and how you would overcome it in the primary?
Well, I don't know that I would overcome it. I mean, I think Trump is off base when he says, I don't want to listen to national security experts. But when he said, I don't want a whole bunch of professors staffing the Fed, I want people who know about, business and growth in the economy, I'm with him all the way on that. But that's professors, that's not experts. With apologies to the many professors I know I see arrayed before me.
Some have went to Harvard as well.
Ah.
This was quite simple. What to do about Attorney General Barr?
It's very distressing. Bill Barr wrote a memo on June 18th of 2018 to the Justice Department, unsolicited, saying, here's my view. The powers of the president under Article 2 of the Constitution, really his exercise of them cannot be questioned, or he'd be in federal criminal court answering for his everyday actions every day, and that would be a slippery slope, and the powers of the president would be so undermined that we would be unable to run a railroad out there, much less a world. So, for example, if the president is exercising his absolute and unlimited power to grant a pardon, you can't ask him why he did it. So, for example, you cannot ask him the question, did you do this because Paul Manafort gave you a $10 million bribe? No, that's unacceptable. You can't ask him because you can't go behind his action. And this is why the president is going around saying, and then there's Article 2, and I can do anything I want under Article 2, because it's what Bill Barr's memo said. And more recently, the AG Barr has married the president's thought that everybody in the world and the federal government exists for the purpose of covering his political skirts. He kind of did a bowdlerized version of the Mueller report when it first came out before anyone had read it, greatly helping the president. And I'm troubled because I knew Bill Barr as an AG under George Bush 41 and later when he was general counsel at major corporations, and he was a beacon of the bar. So I don't know what's happened.
In the time left, I think we should address the poster that was advertised for the talk. Talk to us about what you envision or would like to see for the future of the presidency.
Well, I'd like to see a president who is sensitive to the needs of all Americans, who feels the obligation that I described to take care of all Americans, who wants the country to be unified, who wants us to return to a regime of respecting our military allies instead of making life difficult for them, who will not aid Russia in its effort to retake over Eastern Europe, which seems to be on the table these days with Ukraine and beyond Crimea. But above all, who would evince a different attitude than the Steve Bannon, Donald Trump White House of just spitting anger and trying to make everybody feel as bad as possible as opposed to as good as possible. I think that's the duty of the American presidency.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming.